Hello, welcome to Team CGS, this is Toop speaking. Yes, you've seen it all before, typical 2D beat 'em up. Moving on, but wait, Red Earth is different in so many ways. Oh really? Let me explain. Red Earth, known as Warzard in Japan, was released in November 1996. It was the first game to be released by Capcom on their fledgling CPS-3 arcade board, the successor, believe it or not, to the CPS-2 arcade board, which brought us the awesome Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter Alpha and early Versus series of beat-em-ups. Thing is, Capcom were trying to milk their 2D games in light of the industry's shift to 3D, which of course was brought about by the introduction of Sony's PlayStation. But that's not to say that Capcom weren't interested in trying out something new within an older format. You see, Red Earth was hugely innovative for its time, not just because it went against the grain of previous games within the genre, but against the kind of risks companies like Capcom are usually willing to take. To start with, the game played differently to most 2D fighting games on the market because it only had 4 playable characters: Leo, a king transformed into a beast, Kenji, an elite ninja warrior, Tessa, a girl who studies magic, and Mei Ling, a young martial artist. It also had 8 unplayable bosses, some of whom are really quite tough to beat, and in keeping with typical Capcom tradition, the names of the characters in the Japanese version were different to those here in the West. Red Earth also seems to have been an experiment by Capcom to combine different elements of other popular fighting games. For instance, there were Fatalities, something that you'd normally expect to find in Mortal Kombat, the ability to attack enemies when they were on the ground, something that was and still is often seen in 3D beat-em-ups but rarely if ever in 2D, sprite scaling, a graphical technique that was usually only found in SNK games though later incorporated into Street Fighter 3, RPG elements where you could level up your character to a maximum level of 32 while expanding their moves list and defensive skills, ideas reminiscent of their Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo released earlier that same year where players could pick up gems and orbs during the fight for various benefits like experience, rounds that revolved around the player having 2 health bars like in Killer Instinct or Dark Stalkers, bonus stages similar to those in Street Fighter 2, and a nod perhaps to the Japanese developer Treasure in that the game was comprised almost entirely of boss fights, a common trait found within Treasure games. Fights were comprised of a single round, within which the player had essentially 2 health bars as stated earlier, with the boss's health at the bottom of the screen. I should also mention that even the boss's health bar could be increased depending on how far the player had progressed. Now, when you first started playing, your character's level was quite low, and so players would often find things tough going until they started to level up. Characters could level up by gaining experience either by defeating one of the bosses, by collecting the gems that they could pick up throughout the match, or by completing the generous bonus stages. An obvious nod to Street Fighter 2, where the player could obliterate a Lexus LS400, players had to destroy each part of the statue in order to gain the experience held within. There were also different types of bonus stage that added some nice diversity. It's interesting to note that the player's health bar was carried over to the next stage, and while it would replenish slightly once a boss was defeated, it depended entirely on how well you performed during the fight. An interesting part of Red Earth was the password system it employed. You see, it would give players a password once they were defeated. I know it sounds really strange, and this was used so that they could resume their character's development at a later date. It didn't allow them to carry on from the stage they were last defeated, however, though if players did choose to continue, the boss's health would likewise resume where it left off. This whole setup was quite interesting because it offered a different perspective to standard progression, because it basically encouraged players to persevere with the levelling process in the hope of finally wearing the boss's health down, especially if they were really tough to beat, and would make the player feel as though they were at least getting something in return even if defeat was imminent. The graphics and animation were quite unlike any other 2D Capcom beat-em-up I've ever played because it basically employed the imaginative decor found in Dark Stalkers but on a much more powerful arcade board. Backgrounds, while not as well animated as those found in SNK games, were nevertheless beautifully drawn, and the character animations were possibly the best they ever achieved prior to Street Fighter 3, once again owing to 4 times the power of the CPS-3 to that of its predecessor. The music, which was composed by Takayuki Iwai, was really awesome too, and they even released an official soundtrack that featured 72 compositions, including a 5-minute track by Takayuki himself, dedicated to its listeners and entitled Last Message to Listener. Sadly, Red Earth bombed in the arcades, probably due to a lack of playable characters, because most fighting games sold themselves on the strength of their fighting roster, and with only 4 to choose from, as well as because it was a brand new series, Capcom found it quite difficult to promote. Another reason may have been because of the timing of its release. Even though the Sega Saturn was a much better machine than the PlayStation when it came to 2D games, thanks in part to its greater video memory and added 4MB RAM cartridge, Capcom felt it wouldn't have been able to cope with the power of the CPS-3. This also meant that being able to tap into the popular PlayStation market with a version of its own was completely out of the question. On top of this, while Street Fighter 3 could later be ported to next generation consoles through its name alone, Red Earth on the other hand had no such advantage, because it was, after all, a brand new series that no one had ever heard of. However, don't let that put you off, because it was and still is a deeply engrossing game, especially once you start to level the characters up to level 32. And this is what's really quite sad about Red Earth. In all honesty, the game would have been better suited to the home market than the arcades, primarily because of the levelling up system, and it is indeed a crying shame that it was never released in the home. And so there we go folks, that's me. I hope you enjoyed that. This is Toops from Team CGS. Until next time, I'll see you later. Goodbye.
Level up.